Anyway, that's good, isn't it? Also, today I've got like a sound effect machine on my laptop now, so I can like, you know, if you go like, "What are you doing?" you can just go. Anyway, you didn't join for this nonsense. No, so I thought I would talk to you about what it was like to pull together my poetry collection. So my name is Stephen Lightbown. I'm a Bristol-based poet, and I'm a wheelchair user. And actually, one of the interesting things I think I should say to start with about all of this lockdown and the process of being online is I never felt actually like I would miss the identity of being a wheelchair user, because in this little screen that you can see here, it's just this bit of me, you see. And actually when I'm doing a reading, I realise that what you can see is people see the wheelchair. And actually I think, so when I've got to sort of mention that, because actually when I do a lot of online stuff and I read poems about being a wheelchair user, it doesn't necessarily come across. Also, little shout out, I had some branding done. The Spokeandpencil sessions. That's exciting, isn't it? Look how clever it is. You can't read it because it's flipped around on my camera. Anyway, so my journey towards producing this book, Only Air, which came out last year in March. So it's just over a year old, and it was published by Burning Eye, which is a really wonderful independent publisher based in Bristol. And I'm not going to try, and I've not really made loads of notes, and I'm conscious I've waffled on for 3 minutes and we were going to be here for 20 minutes or so. But I think my poetry journey started in 2012. I was given this, a little a little notebook. And I was kind of a bit of a funky place, and I was given this notebook and just told to write down some of my thoughts and my views and things that were interesting me. And I started to write little bits of poetry, and it was terrible. And I'm going to prove it to you because I'm going to read one of the first things that I wrote. So I'm just going to open it up to the second page. And I wrote this, and I used to write little things like it would say where I wrote it and the date. So I wrote this in Keswick in the Lake District on the 28th of December in 2012. Here you go. I like chips, chips with dips, chips with cheese. Chips really are the bee's knees. I like chips, hot gold bars. You can eat them inside an oven, even in cars. Cover them in salt, rub them in vinegar, stick them in the fork, while the night away. I like chips, they go straight to my hips. They're better than mash. To the chippy I'll dash, because there's nothing I like more than coming through the front door and tucking into a big bag of chips. Magic. Now that poem weirdly didn't make it into my collection, but that was in 2012 that I wrote that. And what I thought was interesting was at that time I didn't read poetry, I didn't engage in poetry, I didn't really know who any poets were, and I was just writing in that little notebook and thinking that what I was writing was better than anything else that was out there, and why would I need to read anything else? And then I think the more I started to read and the more I started to get into it, a bit like anything, I was kind of, I was also doing marathon training at the time, and would do long distance running. And I wouldn't set off and do a marathon without doing any form of training whatsoever. So I kind of wanted to get some coaching and some mentoring, and I signed up for a City Lit course in London where I was living at the time. And it was a 12-week course. I think it was 12 weeks, 10 weeks. And, oh, hi, Victoria. Hi. One of my Zoe Glacier fellows from San Antonio has just joined from America. And Josie as well, and Maya, and Carly. Hi to everyone. And I should say, if you've got questions, stick them in, because there's not loads of people in here, so I can answer questions as I go along. I'll fire out some sound effects. If there's a sound effect you want, just let me know and I'll play a sound effect. I'm just going to get loads of people asking for sound effects now, aren't I? And I signed up for this course with Malika. And at that point, I didn't want to write about my wheelchair. I wanted it to be a complete escape from anything else that I was doing. And what I liked was each week being given a little prompt. And then we were asked to write a poem in the form of a letter. and now I can't remember the name of the of that form. I think it's an ekphrastic poem, is it? Anyway, it'll come to me and I'll share it afterwards. But you write a poem in the form of a letter, and I decided to write a letter from the top half of my body to the lower half of my body. And I read it out, and in fact, I'll read it here. I think this is it. So this poem is called What We've Once Had. And it's time to accept what we've known for years. Things aren't the same between us. Oh, an epistle poem. That's it. Thanks, Victoria. You used to be strong. You used to stand for something. You used to help me stand tall. But now you're a shadow of your former self, weak beneath me. I remember exactly when you stopped feeling. That day will stay with me forever. But we have to move on. You'll always be a part of me. But I fear only a miracle can save us now. And then the response, how dare you? You sit on your throne like a permanently angry king, as though it's all my fault. I spent years carrying you, and then it happened. I had to watch you get stronger as each day passed while I just faded away. I will carry you no more. So I wrote that poem, and I had to read that out, and that was the first poem that I'd read out to a group. And Malika said to me, she said, oh, I think there might be something in that. You should explore this more and write more about being a wheelchair user. And at first I didn't think anything of it. And then when I left that night, I couldn't stop thinking about poems about my chair. I couldn't stop. Everything I saw was just kind of in poem form, and I was just writing all these poems down. And to the point that I'd kind of almost filled a notebook. And this happened over maybe a couple of years. And I got to 2015, don't worry, this isn't going to be every single year up to 2020. I got to 2015 and thought I was approaching the 20th anniversary of my accident. And that was a big deal to me. And I wanted to mark it somehow. I didn't just want to mope about, which is what I had the tendency to do as I approached January, which is when I had my accident. It's a really kind of funky time for me, and I go well within myself, and I'm scared all winter about whether or not it'll snow. So this year, I decided for the 20th anniversary, I wanted to write 20 poems to mark 20 years, and I'd print 20 copies of those. And so I went away and I wrote those, and I produced this little pamphlet myself called Tree. And I actually I've taken this pamphlet out for the first time, and I haven't looked at this for a long time. And I realised, look, it's got a tree and it's got 3 little birds. And then on the cover of my book, look, a tree and 3 little birds. Did I know that? Did I not? It was lodged in here. Anyway, so I wrote this pamphlet, and in the same year, 2016, I moved to Bristol, and my wife and I moved to Bristol, and I then poetry then just exploded for me. Hang on a minute, I can prove what it did. It did this. Sound effect. Sound effect. Sound effects. And poetry just exploded, because for me in London, the poetry scene was too big. There was too many venues, there was too many people, there's too much going on for me to kind of get around London and go to poetry. But here in Bristol, there was just an influx not an influx, there was just a range of such fabulous nights, from Hammer and Tongue, Raise the Bar, Milk. They were kind of the first ones that I came across. And I was going to those, and I was absorbing poetry and writing more, and just encouraged to share, because there's such a phenomenal poetry scene in Bristol. We are so lucky, and everybody is so giving in terms of their feedback. And you would read a poem and someone would give a bit of feedback. You read a poem, someone gives a bit of feedback, and it really gives you this lift. And we'd been here for about 4 or 5 months. And then I'd had an illness and was in bed for about a week. And I'd stuck in bed, and it was in that week that I set up this Instagram account for Spokeandpencil. And things kind of rolled from there. And then I signed up for, I applied to something where someone said they wanted to photograph spoken word artists. And I went to this photo shoot with a guy called Ash Holdsworth, and I was talking to him, and I read a poem out of this pamphlet, and he said, oh yeah, that's really good. And I said, it is, but I don't know, I'm not too sure what to do with these, and I'd really like to try and get a mentor. And Ash introduced me to an absolute stalwart and phenomenal person in the Bristol poetry scene, and that was Rebecca Tantoni. And I had a mentor session with Rebecca, and that was exactly what I needed, because Rebecca, I had one session, and then later on through my manuscript process, I had a regular session with Rebecca. And I'm going to talk about later some top tips, but I would definitely say you need to get a mentor in this process. You need someone that can be not emotionally connected to your poems, and in some way help you also not be emotionally connected to your poems. One of the best bits of advice that Rebecca gave to me was she would read a poem, and it was an account of something that had happened. And Rebecca had said, I don't think that word works there, or I don't think that phrase works. And I said, yeah, but that's what that person said to me. And Rebecca said, you don't need to be word for word accurate. I'm paraphrasing. You don't need to be word for word accurate for the poem to tell the truth. You know, it has to be a version of the truth for the point still to come across. And that was really helpful for me, because then I knew I wasn't just going to be giving word for word accounts of what had happened, of memories of things that had happened in my life. So I had this session with Rebecca, and then Rebecca booked me for the Bristol Harbour Festival, and in 2016, it was around that time. And what was fantastic there was that Bridget, one of the main people, along with Clive, alongside Bernie and I, was there. And on the back of that session, Bernie and I asked me if I would put forward a manuscript. And that was amazing. Like, I was so happy to be asked to do that, but also felt like a massive imposter. Like, who is this bloke? I'd written a couple of years ago poems about chips, and was still writing poems about chips. The first poem I read out in Bristol was about a jacket potato. So I love the carbs and I love the spuds. Good work. I don't have a sound effect for spuds, but let's know. And so I was so happy about that. But then I needed to do some work, so I signed up for a much more intensive period of mentoring with Rebecca. And what that helped me to do was first of all recognise that my reading list of poetry that I read was too narrow. It was people that I related to. It was people that the kind of criticism that gets given of dead white male poets, and I needed to expand that. And Rebecca first of all helped me expand the reading list, but also we workshop poems. And I think probably the best thing to do here is to give an example of what that is. So I'm going to read two poems very quickly. And you can see some of the editing process that went into this. This is Trials and Tribulations of a Tireless Teenager. And this is from this poem. This is from the pamphlet. Growing up, I was excitable as a Labrador puppy, always running from one accident to the next, falling off rusty bikes and rickety tree swings. The first aid box and a mischievous grin were never far away. I spent more time in A&E than after school clubs, collecting scars in the way friends collected stickers and stamps. I had no limits, thought I was indestructible. An energetic child became a risk-taking teen. One brutal winter, it was this brazen bravado that got me in trouble while sledging in a pair of jeans. What a mistake that was. All those stitches, bruises and plaster casts from my earlier years were messages I choose to ignore, only becoming clear whilst my frozen jeans were surgically removed yet again in A&E, this time fighting for survival. So what we were able to do with this poem was think it just needed tightening up a bit. It needed a bit more detail. It needed to be punchier and kind of have that emotional punch. So this is the poem that it became. And this is Trials and Tribulations, and this is in the book. From toddler to teen, I was as excitable as a Labrador puppy. I'd bump from one accident to the next. The first aid box and mischievous grin were never far away. I spent more time in A&E than after school clubs, collected scars in the way friends traded panini stickers and shinies. I told myself I was indestructible. I believed that to be true until a rancorous winter arrived like a mugging in the night. I would change forever. I couldn't swap this sticker. It was my frozen clothes, jacket, hoodie, jumper, t-shirt, jeans, boxers, socks, trainers, shield of invincibility or surgically removed. I think back to the messages I chose to ignore from the stitches, bruises and plaster casts I've worn before. Finally, it becomes clear. I understand the shadow in the room. It is danger, it is real, it is here, and it has come for me. And I think the biggest thing between those two poems is, apart from the fact it's a little tighter, is that I've taken imagery and I've run that through the poem rather than using lots of different imagery. So I guess the imagery that comes back is of the panini sticker, but saying that I couldn't swap that later on. That's one of the main things that changed in that poem. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was in terms of doing the book, maybe I had about 100 poems in total that made it down to about 49. And it was important, you know, I think there's a temptation sometimes to write a poem and put that in a collection, write a poem, put that in a collection, and write a collection's worth of poems over a period of a year and think, right, I have enough for a manuscript now, and just send those out. But I think it's really important to sit back and think, what is the story that you want to tell with the book that you do? What's the kind of the structure and that narrative that's in there, and how does it kind of all hang together? And there is an argument about people that decide whether or not they want to pick a book up and kind of flick through the book, stop and read a poem. Or people think that they get a bit frustrated by the fact you've put the effort together to put every single poem into an order, which is what happened with mine. But I kind of appreciate that people may pick a book up and flick through it and stop on a poem. Or people may start at page 1 and work through. But either way, I wanted it to kind of hang together. So I knew I was talking about my experiences of being a wheelchair user. And for me, I think I wanted to talk about the transition from hospital, where I spent 6 months, to my adult life. And that 6 months felt so pivotal that I almost felt like I'd kind of gone from being born to being released again into the world over a 6 month period. And I went through what I felt like was 6 distinct phases. So they became 6 chapters in the book. And they were the accident, stabilising, sitting up, starting again, setbacks, and going home. Now, the poems that are in there aren't chronological. I've got a question here. How many poems are in the book? 49, Carly. If you've been listening, I did say 49. But thanks for asking a question. Those six sections have 6 poems in each. 7 poems in each, sorry. But as I say, they're not chronological. But say as an accident, the accident, poems about that might also include, I don't know, knocking a cup of tea over. And that is also an accident, but kind of relating to maybe have I knocked that over because of, did I stumble because I've lost my balance or something because of being in a wheelchair. So how have I related those? And they made up those 6 different sections. As I was writing the poems, I also realised I was starting to write more and more about my dad, who died when I was 21. And I hadn't realised that within writing these poems, it would also be a fairly cathartic exercise to kind of address some of the issues about my dad, who left home when I was 8 and we would go and see every Saturday. But then as I got older, just before my accident when I was 16, I kind of turned to Dad and said that I didn't want to go to his house anymore on Saturdays. And when I had my accident, Dad had a very different response to my mum. It was more about, oh, you can come and live with us, you'll watch telly, we'll look after you. Whereas my mum was much more, you're going to go to sixth form, you're going to go to uni, do what you wanted to do anyway, and nothing's going to change. So these poems started to come out about my dad, and I realised I wanted a poem about my dad in each of those sections. So then when I knew I had 6 sections with 6 titles, and each one had to contain a poem about my dad, that helped me then go through those 100 poems I had to kind of put them under those headings. And I knew there was things I wanted to kind of tackle in there, from dating, from injuries, from illness, about my own kind of thoughts on mortality, and all of that kind of went into that process. And again, working through that with Rebecca until I'd kind of honed down the manuscript, and then sent that to Burning Eye. And that process then of sending the manuscript off to kind of further editing it, working through, again, was about another year. So in total, it was maybe about a 2-year process from kind of flirting with Burning Eye to getting the manuscript together to then producing it. But then there was other things in terms of a cover. I knew I wanted to kind of have a cover designed, something that was unique to me. My wife went to school and had childhood friends and is still familiar with someone who was an illustrator. So I contacted her, I sent her the manuscript and gave her a sense of the fact that I wanted the tree, because my accident, I was sledging and I hit a tree. I wanted that to come across and to kind of regrowth and rebirth and elements of the book and the poetry in there. So that's why we have the tree and the nothing there and all the elements of there on the other side. And that was really important to me. And I would say, as well as doing the workshops and the mentoring, workshops is really key. Go and be stimulated in workshops. Go and do as many workshops as you can. Hear from other poets about what they're doing and read as many poets as you can. That will help you in your writing. And ask yourself what it is you want to try and get across with the book. I think I was a bit upset when I showed the book to a couple of people at first and someone said, "Oh, I think you've got a bit of a disjointed voice. I think you need to find your voice a bit more." And I've always kind of struggled with that, because actually, when do we ever have one voice? I have a different voice at work as I do at home. I have a different voice with some friends than I do with others. And I've definitely had a different voice over 25 years of being a wheelchair user, of being a stubborn little shit, of being moping around the house, of falling out of my chair and throwing it across the room and then not knowing how I'm going to get it, of being in love, of having my heart broken, of being losing people, and all of this kind of coming together, and all of those different things over those years didn't have one voice. So I like the fact it's slightly disjointed. I like the fact that the poems don't necessarily sound like they've been written by the same person all the way through, because it's written over a period of time when I wasn't the same person. The only thing that was dissimilar was these massive ears and my wheelchair. And I'm greyer than I was when I started this, and yeah, all sorts of things have changed. So I think that's important, is read well though. I just attended a reading with Roger Robinson, who said, if you write 100 poems, make sure you've read 1,000. And I think that's really, really critical. I think that's really good advice. Is, you know, you'll start to hear yourself in other poems. You'll start to mimic other poems. You'll start to then find a style that's unique to you. And for me, I'd like to kind of use surreal imagery. So there's a poem in here about being angry. And that anger is a bear that walks around with me and attacks people on the street. So I think there's quite a lot of surrealism comes through that I hadn't necessarily realised. But also just be authentic. Just write yourself in there. Don't try and say the next magnificent thing. Don't try and win the next prize that's out there, because you won't. You've just got to write from your heart. You've got to write what matters to you. And if it matters to you, it'll matter to somebody else. And I think that's the best bit of advice that I can give. I'm going to read one last poem and then give 5 tips before I finish. So the key thing for me is, some people say, where did you get the title Only Air from? And what I did when I read the manuscripts over and over and over and over and over, and I was writing down little phrases that jumped out at me and little things that I thought might be interesting. And I read this one poem and the title came to me from there. And this poem is about being released from hospital and going back to the house that I'd lived in beforehand, and it not feeling like the home that I knew. And so if you see, and there's a really key line in this for me, which was a real pivotal moment about realising that I was different to the person that I was. So if you spot the title of the book, Only Air, I don't know, do something in the comment section. This poem's called Unwelcome Home. Summer is here. Suntans have long since replaced scarves. At last, I'm home. I'd left half a year earlier on a snowy Saturday, reluctantly wrapped in layers of wool, with an almost prophetic warning. Mum had heated my ears about catching a death. I'm no longer in a coat, now a wheelchair. It's as I remember, and yet everything has changed, almost like I've come through the wrong front door. set at my old height. Even the mirrors disdainfully snub my existence. Mirror, mirror on the wall, why have I been ostracised from the daily changing family portrait in the reflective glass? Mum, brother, only heir where once were my eyes. This was where I'd check my school tie. The knot in my stomach tightens with a loss I cannot yet articulate. It's not the mirrors that highlight the shame I can't see. The step under the letterbox through which cold comfort condolence cards are fed is adorned with an unwelcome mat just for me. A dignity eroding commode sits uncomfortably in the living room. Everything out of reach but the kitchen sink. What does it mean to call something a home? Whatever this was, it no longer feels the way it once did. I am a stranger. My family, rocked by tragedy, try to live as normal, while I, ghost in the wheelchair, am unfamiliar in a once familiar place. Thanks. So I think that is almost it. I could have probably talked for about 3 days on pulling this book together. But I think if it's something that people are interested in, please email me in the comments. Follow me at Spokeandpencil. And this will be up for a day or so. I'll stick it in my Instagram TV. I'll share it wherever. And I thought, though, what would be helpful was to give you my 5 top tips. So number 1, read more than you write. Oh, hang on a minute. I had something for this, right? Because I've got these. I've got my sound effects. So I was going to say, here are my 5 top tips. Here are my 5 top tips. I mean, that's a drum roll. You probably couldn't hear it. Number 1, read more than you write. So that's what I was just saying. Read more poems than you write. If you write 1 poem, try and read 5 poems. And read poems from poets that you might not like. Read poems that confuse you. Read poems that baffle you. Read poems that make you cry. Read poems that make you smile. Read poems in languages you don't understand and see how the different words roll in the tongue and how they kind of feel in your mouth. Kind of get a feel for how a poem is. So read more than you write. 2, devour feedback. Get yourself a mentor. Send off submissions. Join writing groups. Put a poem on a Facebook page. Meet poets that you're happy to kind of almost do a share over a beer and get some feedback. But get feedback. Get as much feedback. Be a junkie on feedback. Don't be afraid of feedback. And I get feedback, and at first I was a bit like, but I like that poem, I like that line, I'm really sad that you've taken it out. But then I was like, hey, this poem's much better. So get the feedback, listen to it. But also kind of don't always take everything on board, the feedback. If 1 person says something to you, that's interesting. If 10 people say the same thing, maybe there's something in that. You don't have to listen to all feedback, but you have to listen to it and see if you want to listen to it or not use it. So get as much feedback. 3, try and figure out the narrative that you want your book to tell you. If you're going to throw all the poems up you've ever written and they land down in a weird order, that's a conscious decision that you've made. But be present in that decision-making process. But try and figure out what the story is from page 1 to the last page. And if someone opens it in the middle, that they still can get that feel for who you are. 4, and this is really key, is find the right publisher. Don't just send your poems out willy-nilly just to anybody and hope that they'll land and that someone will publish them. For me, Burning Eye, I think, was somebody that I'd kind of been watching. I was really interested in. I loved the poets that they published. I liked the fact that I didn't necessarily have to have had been published in loads of clever literary journals or magazines, that I didn't necessarily have a massive profile, and that they are very clear that they want to champion voices that haven't necessarily been heard. And that was really key for me. So when Bernie and I said they were interested, I knew that we were going to work well together, and working well with the editors and the people you're going to email on a day-to-day basis, that is key, because you're going to have a relationship with these people for at least a year to 2 years. And I absolutely adore Burning Eye. I think they are wonderful, hard working, beautiful souls, and I'm really privileged to be a part of that family. And you need to feel that you are part of a family, I think. That's my own personal view. anyway about finding the right publisher. And 5, be committed. You know, be really sure that this is something that you want to do, because I've probably spent more money on books than I've made on selling books, which you put postage in and things like that. But God, I love this book. I love it so much. I'm so proud of it. And it really tells a story of who I am and the journey that I've been on. And it's a real kind of marker in the sand for me. And in many ways, it's the sort of, the kind of my autobiography, which is daft as that sounds, but I'm so happy to have it and for it to be out in the world. And if someone can relate to it in any way, I'm really pleased about that. But it's been such a really long process in pulling that together. And you have to know that you're going to be looking at these poems day after day after day, and that they're going to be there with you. You're going to wake up thinking about them. You're going to be dreaming about these poems. You're going to be editing them till you're sick of looking at them. And you're going to have to put them in a drawer and then take them out again in 6 months when you're not emotionally connected to them. And I think that's really key. And you're not going to make loads of money. And that's the brutal truth of it. But actually, if you end up with this book and it means something to you, it'll definitely mean something to someone else. But just be prepared to put the hard yards in. And you'll be so pleased with it once it comes out. And then also once it's published, don't mind if it's got a typo in it. My book's got a typo in it. And that is classic me. Because this is back to front. I sent an all staff email out to my entire organisation of 8,000 people today, and I was meant to send it from a different account. I sent it from my account. So the fact that there's a typo in that book is real. That's me. That's true to me. So I like that typo, and I'm owning that typo. Anyway, enough wobbling, enough waffling. Thank you very much. I think you all deserve a polite clap. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. As I said, this will be up for the next 24 hours and I'll post it on Instagram TV. You've all been a dream. My name's Stephen Lightbown. Follow me on @Spokeandpencil and go and write a poem. Bye-bye.